Watcher, it's your boy Jack Slack. While I'm working on something a bit more interesting for Monday, while this little drought of fights is going on and then we got 3 events back to back, I thought I'd share a bit of one of the episodes I did last year on Chinese history, and particularly the history of British in China, or the British in China. This extract is from the 3rd episode in that series. It was a trilogy, so the final episode in that series, and it's about the Boxer Rebellion, something which has become, or certainly, when I was reading the news yesterday, it became oddly current for me. If you like your martial arts history, there's a little bit of that in there. If you like your cults and your people with red turbans on storming government buildings, then this is the one for you. If it's not for you, don't worry, we'll be back to the normal stuff soon. But if you want to get access to the full thing and the entire series on the British in China, sign up to the Patreon. I'll put links in the description on YouTube, and I'll catch you soon. Cheers. But by 1898, tensions haven't receded, and things become their worst, again by a turn of, natural disaster. The Yellow River overflows, floods rather, due to heavy rainfall in 1898, and that destroys all the crops. And then the following year has exceptionally low rainfall, meaning that there's a second bad harvest. Interestingly enough, it says in the books, worst on record, but the Meteorological Society was set up by Robert Hart like 10 years before this, so the record isn't much. But these sort of things, again, we saw it with the Taiping. It's when young men are hungry and have no work to keep them on. You're not working in the field because there's no food to harvest, and you're hungry, so you've got time to think about it and nothing to do. And that's when people become dangerous. So there's this long history of secret societies. We talked about the triads, and the Taiping would have started as sort of a secret society. These people who band together in self-defense, but then also become sort of bandits. You band together and arm yourself to protect yourself from bandits, but you also then end up upsetting, the formal government powers in the area by being a large armed band. There's a secret society called the Big Sword Society in Shandong, and another one called the Spirit Boxers, and these sort of lend themselves to, but also amalgamate into, what are called the Fists of Harmony and Righteousness, or the Righteous Harmonious Fists, and we call them the Boxers. That's what the Western powers called them, because they practiced martial arts in open areas together. And again, not boxing as in shadow boxing, but that's what it would have reminded Western powers of, or Western observers of. One of the interesting things reading about the Boxers generally is that because there's this long history of lineages in martial arts, everything comes from one of 2 temples, Wudang or Shaolin or whatever it is, and they all come down through various disciples who escaped during fires and shit like that. You think, oh wow, I wonder how this is related to martial arts. But no, this is to do with more of a more regular phenomenon, which there's a great book called History in 3 Keys, subtitled The Boxers as an Event, Experience and Myth, and that's by Paul Cohen. And it sort of gives some examples of cases like this happening in Chinese history. The secret societies and large religious movements aren't at all unusual in the grand scheme of things in China. We're coming fresh off the Taiping, which is probably the most remarkable religious movement in Chinese history. How no one's Christian, and then suddenly everyone's sort of Christian for 15 years. But spirit possession is something that catches on often when, or at least in Cohen's examples, often when people are at a massive military disadvantage. And that's never more obvious than not just when you're outnumbered, but when you're going up against modern technologies that you can't possibly use or create yourself. So guns are the first thing, and spirit possession, the main boast about it is that once these people have performed this ritual, they become impervious to bullets. The first time you read that, it's just a standard superhero trope. You're going, okay, so what are his other powers? But when you realise that that's the focal point, being impervious to bullets, you realise, oh yeah, okay, that would probably be their main concern. If you are so thoroughly outmatched by these foreign armies, that you just don't have guns and they do. But spirit possession is a fascinating subject. And again, this book by Paul Cohen is fantastic for that, because there's just lots of interesting little examples by other smaller groups in China, and how it sort of became a fairly commonplace phenomenon in that it's appeared many times through Chinese history. But there's a series that Chris Crudelli, who's like a kung fu guy, did on the BBC a while ago. He did a series called Mind, Body and Kick-Ass Moves, which was like just him going around and meeting various martial artists and fawning over their sort of like chi tricks. But then he did a follow-up called Mind, Body and Kick-Ass Miracles, I think it was. And in that, he meets some Chinese dudes, and they do very similar sort of spirit possession, summon down the ghosts of ancestors and so on, and then they all take turns eating this glass that they've smashed up. And I mean, it could be a fake glass, could be sugar glass for all I know, but it's almost exactly that. It's summoning down something else so that when you are doing the dangerous thing, it's not actually you doing it. And this links in with the ancestor. I'm not sure what the actual sociological name for it is, but the Western powers always call it ancestor worship. But that veneration of ancestors, the deep respect that both Confucianism and folk Chinese religion place on ancestors, it links in with this spirit possession stuff. And it also links in with this, historical figures become deities and vice versa, that myth and reality become intertwined. That's how close religion and life are at this time. But people like Guando or Guan Yu is a real character, but also becomes a deity. And I say Guan Yu because Guan Yu is one of the examples they often give, summon down the spirit of Guan Yu or Zhang Fei, both characters in the Three Kingdoms era, both legendary warriors. But the other thing about this spirit possession practice is that it's very similar to the sort of paramilitary movements, things like the brown shirts in Germany. Again, we've gone back to the Nazis, sorry, but you know how these things spring up, and it's that going with them and becoming strong and useful in a group, but also that group is saying to you, we need your strength. So you're becoming part of something bigger, but also being made stronger as a result. And that's obviously appealing to young men who are in a hopeless situation. Furthermore, the Boxers were welcoming to women, and women are not well treated generally in Chinese public life at this point. The women from the legations write that if they ever went out into the city proper, obviously chaperoned by men, but they'd get stuff thrown at them and they get hissed. It's not a very nice society to women at the time. And again, the Manchu wanted to start moving away from foot binding, but the Han were like, we're not having that. We love our foot binding, but don't ask any of the women. And female literacy rates drag way behind male literacy rates and so on. But the Boxers had their own female divisions called the Red Lanterns, and they had their own feats that they allegedly performed, like they could flap a fan and blow bullets away, or fly over the highest walls. And again, highest walls, bullets, these are all, how are we going to beat modern military if we don't have anything? But what's so interesting about the Boxers is that it's almost a hysteria. It's almost just a thing that catches and spreads. There are some sources will list famous boxers, but there's only a few, like Cao Fuqian and Zhang Desheng. But most books don't even bother mentioning them because they're pretty ancillary characters. I mean, Cao Fuqian is supposed to have met the Empress Dowager at one point, and she admires him, but that could be myth for all we know. Like, they're not very well documented people. The important point is that the Boxers, through having a practice, have a way to spread, and they perform in town squares and things like that. It's a great way to advertise and bring people in. So anyone who's listed as a leader of the Boxers, it's not so much a well-organized movement. Even the big swords and the spirit boxers, who they are supposed to have taken inspiration from, become involved with the activities of the Boxers. So as the famine drags on, attacks on the railways and the telegraph lines by Boxers become more frequent, and this naturally graduates into churches and missionary posts. By 1899, the governor of Shandong, which is where most of this Boxer activity is happening to begin with, is under pressure to punish the Boxers. And on the last day of 1899, December 31st, the Boxers kill a British missionary named Sidney Brooks. This brings us to where the most famous part of the Boxer Rebellion unfolds, the legation quarter in Peking/Beijing. When the British and French secured the right to post consuls in Beijing at the end of the Second Opium War, the Zhongli Yamen was set up as a foreign ministry, and then each nation was assigned some land within the legation quarter. The British legation was the largest on Legation Street, and most of the legations were in the same sort of area, but others, like the Austrian legation, was slightly further out and away from Legation Street. The legation quarter was located inside the Tartar city. This is a city within a city within a city. Peking or Beijing has its own walled city, with houses obviously stretching outside of that. Within that, there is the Tartar city, which is again walled, and within the Tartar city there is another walled city, which is the Imperial city or the Forbidden city. So the legation quarter is inside of the main area of the city and walled off by the Tartar wall, and within walking distance of the Imperial city and the palace. Within the Tartar city there are several cathedrals, and the legation quarter itself is between the wall of the Tartar city and the wall of the Imperial city on the lower east side. You can pull up a map of this. It's quite interesting how it's laid out. The Peking Cathedral the North Cathedral is the largest religious building in the capital, and that's some distance from the legation quarter. There's a small canal running through the legation quarter, over which you have to cross between the British embassy and the side with the Austrian embassy, and the citizens of the legation quarter call that the Jade River because it's normally green and murky, but it acts as a nice barrier in this engagement and becomes important when the Battle of Beijing happens. So each nation has its own consul to the Chinese government, and they find that they don't really make much progress in any talks with the Chinese government anyway. They're basically just there to serve a sentence. Sir Claude MacDonald is the British consul, and Edwin Conger is the American minister, and there's another chap called Pichon, who is the French minister, and they all get together and, along with the other powers, they send a letter to the government demanding justice for Sidney Brooks's murder. While the Zongli Yamen, which is pretty useless but generally seen as favourable to the foreigners rather than the hardcore conservative branch of the court, says that they'll get to work on it, but a couple of days later the official government decree comes out and is far too vague for the liking of the consuls, going as far as to exonerate the Boxer movement and say that these groups of people who historically these secret societies have been a nuisance and put down constantly, but this particular decree declares that the secret societies are intended for groups to practice gymnastics together and serve each other in mutual protection. With more and more news of the Boxers outside of the city coming in, the consuls write to the Zongli Yamen again and say that something has to be done about the Boxers in late January, but the government go radio silent. This is when it's presumed that there's a good deal of bickering over the importance and fate of the Boxers in the imperial court. However, the accounts from the legations state that by April the Boxers are openly practicing their rituals and their spirit possession in public areas in Beijing, and pamphlets and posters are going up calling for a rising against the foreign powers. By May, there are reports that large numbers of Chinese Catholics have been killed in Kowloon, and a preacher in a nearby missionary station is murdered. Now, the missionaries seem the keenest on involving the government and military power as soon as possible. Perhaps it's because they're on the ground and they understand. Perhaps it's because they're the ones who feel the most threatened. But Bishop Favier, who is the head of the Peking Cathedral, the large cathedral in the north, writes to his consul, the French consul Pichon, and insists that he gets troops, or he sends word for troops. The worry this entire time is that the telegram lines have been set up to Beijing. They now have instant, or almost instant, contact with the rest of their empires, or at least, people who can act on these threats. But the concern is that soon enough, the telegraph lines will be cut. That could be a tactical decision to trap the legations without contact, but also the Boxers' entire MO up to now has been tearing up train lines and cutting down telegraph lines because they believe that they are one of the things that's creating this negative weather and harvests. Things start to get a little bit too uncomfortable. As we're getting towards the summer, the heat in Beijing can get too much for those living there, and many of the consuls keep a home out in the hills outside of the city that they travel to, or certainly if the consul is staying in Beijing and in the legation quarter, his family will travel out to. So Claude MacDonald has a summer home out in the hills, which is looted and destroyed, even though he just had it done up. And Herbert Squires, who works at the American legation, has his children out at their summer home when a nearby railway at Fangtao is attacked. And Herbert Squires and a journalist called George Morrison, who are both living in the legations, ride out on horseback to save the women who have gone vacationing there. And they form a convoy with some armed Chinese servants, and they work their way back to the city. But the groundskeeper who they leave behind and his family are promptly murdered as the place is ransacked. In fairness, the Squire's home and several others are converted temples, which obviously doesn't help the case that the foreign powers aren't, harming the relationship between the heavens and the earth and whatnot. Finally, as the Boxers begin to practice closer and closer to the legation quarter, the consuls finally reach out and ask to have troops sent to guard the legations. A force of about 350 soldiers of various nationalities arrive by train from Tianjin, and the multinational nature of the force immediately becomes a problem as they can't decide who's going to march at the lead. Some of the British, who had the most forces available in that short space of time, were forced to stay behind because the Russians distrust the British so much, and they didn't like being so outnumbered on the small exhibition or whatever you call it, expedition. Finally, it's the US Marines who decide to march at almost a run into the city. Surprisingly, there's no act of hostility. None of the Boxers attack them or anything. They just make haste and get into the legation quarter. The problem is that this has been put together at very short notice, and they don't have much in the way of supplies, including ammunition. In fact, a lot of the ammunition is left at Tianjin Station, and they only have, between all of the armies, they have 3 machine guns of various makes and ages, which is concerning if you're fighting a poorly armed but massively larger force. And you've been living by the poem that whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun and they have not. While the relief is tangible and the citizens of the legation quarter feel a degree safer with all the additional armed guards that they now have, they still get more reports of violence outside of the city and rioting and looting and things by the Boxers. So finally, MacDonald and Pichon and Conger write to their commanders and they ask for more troops. The best placed man to offer a response is Admiral Seymour, or Vice Admiral Seymour, who's part of the British Navy. And on the 10th of June, he sends confirmation to the legations that they are sending reinforcements, but almost immediately after, the telegraph lines are cut. The mood grows worse and worse, and the citizens of the legation quarter are reluctant to head anywhere outside the legation quarter, and those in the main part of Legation Street are reluctant to even leave that street. The consuls continue to write to the Zongli Yemen, but they continue to be met with silence, and they find that many of the old names in the Zongli Yemen have been replaced overnight by more staunch conservative members of the court, including Prince Duan, who becomes sort of the antagonist in this whole affair. When in the aftermath, everything is pinned on Prince Duan by Cixi. And in fact, it's Prince Duan who's credited as making the meeting between Cao Futian and Cixi, if that did indeed happen. It's at this point that the Japanese consul, a guy called Sugiyama, decides that he's had enough and he's going to take a train out of there before the option is unavailable. So he heads down to the station, and a point is made in Diana Preston's book that he wore a bowler hat and a tailcoat because obviously the Meiji Restoration and the Japanese are starting to dress like Westerners in the course of their modernization. That the army are supporting the Boxers, or the government has lost control of the army. But by this point, everyone's cleared out of the legation quarter who isn't a member of the legations. All of the Chinese servants of the enormous households in the legation have been given death threats. They know that if they stay there, they're dead. And it's especially weird for people like George Morrison, who speaks good Chinese because he's a journalist, and he keeps a full household of servants, and he's told by some of his servants what the Boxers are saying about them. And all of it's pretty ominous. And then on June 13th, a Boxer appears on Legation Street. Now the Boxers, it's an interesting thing because there aren't really many photos of them. And if you believe some accounts, there's only like one photo of them, and it was taken in the aftermath of the Boxers, so you don't really have any there are photos of Boxers practicing, but there's just, some people say that they're staged enactment things. Some people say they aren't actually the Boxers, but the Boxers themselves wore lots of red, a red turban, but not like a Sikh turban, just like a rag worn on the top of the head. It's more like a bandana, and red armbands and things like that. They basically wore a lot of red. And this boxer is sitting on a cart in the middle of the legation quarter, just brazenly attempting to intimidate the members of the legation. And Baron von Kettler, who is the German consul and becomes a major figure in this quarrel, comes out and begins to viciously beat this man with a stick. And the boxer escapes, but they realise that he's left a small boy, presumably his son, behind, so they beat the shit out of him too and capture him. And that's when it all kicks off. The riots begin and the boxers begin an attack on the legations. Supposedly, the Austrians are the first to open fire, and they do so with their Maxim gun, which they've set up over the previous days. But they fail to kill any of the boxers, which, if you are part of a spirit possession army, is probably going to bolster your morale. Now, the British, French, Germans, and the other legations had been working hard to prepare for the event of riots, and they put up barricades along Legation Street and around the perimeter of the large area that the legations covered. However, they hadn't been ready for it to happen as soon as it did, and von Kettler was rightly judged by the other members of the legation for his temper and how he basically started the violence. But even as the troops guarded the barricades, von Kettler decided to get out a pistol and stand on top of the barricades shooting at the boxers, because obviously the boxers not equipped with weaponry beyond the melee for the most part. This is where the government has to come down on her side, and Empress Dowager Cixi ultimately sides with the boxers, issuing a decree that the foreign legations must leave Beijing by 4 p.m. the next day. Obviously, if you are inside what is becoming a siege, and the people who are outside your walls want to kill you, it's not going to be very convincing to say, yep, just leave, get out now, go. Especially as the boxers aren't part of the Imperial Army. They are just people who are angry. If you walk through the streets, well, it's very reminiscent of the retreat from Afghanistan, which is, a good deal earlier. But in that case, an enormous British army retreated from Afghanistan and was just cut down on the route. So you would be pretty naive to get out and go over the walls and walk out, or try and walk out of Beijing, especially as Sugiyama had tried to and been murdered. The legation's response to this is to demand more time. Even if they decided to leave and they actually believed they could go through it, they would need more time to get ready to do it. And to decide the best way to walk out in formation, obviously, and keep the non-armed members of the party protected by having, by the positioning of the soldiers. More likely, though, they were stalling for time because they understand that Seymour is en route. But they don't get a reply, and so von Kettler, living up to the image of him that you had in the past couple of minutes, decides to go and confront the Zongli men himself. He gets a sedan chair, and he heads out with his manservant, and is promptly murdered, and his manservant makes it back injured and says that he was killed by an Imperial troop. Similarly, a guy called Herbert James walks out to try and talk to the boxers and is shot, again, suspicious because we don't think the boxers have that many rifles and probably aren't good shots with them if they are, because they're a peasant movement. And Herbert James dies, by the way. So the legation set about strengthening their barricades, counting their provisions, and counting their numbers. Within the legation quarter, there are 400 legation members, and between 2,000 and 4,000, so we'll say about 3,000, Chinese Christians. And the Chinese Christians are ignored throughout this entire affair. As everyone's dishing out food between themselves and rationing things, the Chinese are pretty much ignored. And that's probably the worst part of this whole thing. The numbers of injured and dead are kept for the legation members, but not for the Chinese Christians, which makes the entire thing about converting them seem really insincere. The solidified lines of the legations shrink back because the Dutch and Belgian legations are considered too far out to effectively defend, and there's too much space between them and the main compound, which just complicates matters and complicates getting ammunition and supplies out to them, and just makes it more of a hassle than it should be to maintain a line around them. So they drop back, and then the Austrians and Italians somehow get startled by the Boxers and retreat prematurely, and then they try and go back, and they've lost the place that they came from. So the whole Legation Quarter shrinks down to focusing around Legation Street and is bordered by the Jade River and the Tartar Wall. Now, through the early stages of the fighting, the Boxers try and use the fact that they are in a city, so the buildings often connect to each other, and they try and use this by setting light to the buildings on Legation Street that aren't part of the legation and aren't within the legation lines. They begin torching buildings, so the legation try and tear down parts of the building or just move the lines back to consolidate. What they don't see coming is that the Chinese set light to the Hanlin, a Chinese government library, essentially. It has ancient texts in of incredible value, and the Boxers just set it up in flames because it's attached to the Legation Quarter. This has been an extract from a 2-hour episode on the Boxer Rebellion, the third in a series on the British in China. If it seems like your cup of tea, and tea features heavily in the series, check out the Patreon. I'm your boy Jack Slack, and I'll catch you in a couple of days. Cheers!